It was a truth universally acknowledged, though seldom admitted with any degree of public enthusiasm, that the seaside village of Bleatmarsh-on-Sea possessed all the charm of a damp pincushion. The steady drizzle that had beset the county for nearly a week added an air of enforced intimacy to its genteel decline. The scent of seaweed mixed with the faintly sour tang of unwashed wool, and the rhythm of the tide was punctuated not only by gull cries, but by the creak of ancient floorboards, and the occasional distant bell of a foghorn struggling against the mist. In short, a setting ripe for scandal, or at least for a murder, or so I thought when I found myself alighting from the late afternoon train, clutching my umbrella and the peculiar case that was soon to occupy my better hours. My companion in this misadventure was none other than the local vicar, the Reverend Cornelius Pettigrew, a man whose enthusiasm for divine matters was exceeded only by his interest in secular gossip, particularly of the kind that furnished parish magazines with lurid headlines. "Quite extraordinary, Lord Peter," he enthused, peering through his spectacles at the small, battered coach that awaited us. "Mrs. Runsible's death has shaken the entire parish. She was such a fixture, hard as nails, as they say, and yet the poor woman was found quite dead in her study, the chair still warm, no less. Murder, surely, and in Bleatmarsh of all places," to which I responded, adjusting my cravat, with the air of one who has heard such proclamations too often to be immediately persuaded. "Warm chairs and seaside villages, Pettigrew, are hardly proof positive of foul play. I rather suspect that murder, surely, is a phrase you have been nurturing ever since your last sermon was interrupted by the vicar's wife's cat." He smiled, unfazed. "But, my dear Lord Peter, there are peculiar circumstances." The window was left ajar, despite the chill, and the clock in the study stopped at precisely 7 minutes past 9. Coincidentally, the time Mrs. Runcible was supposed to receive her solicitor's final letter. Her niece swears she heard voices, but the servants swear to knowing nothing at all. Ah, servants swearing to nothing at all. The bedrock of all good mysteries. One might be forgiven for believing that if servants ever did know everything, they would not be so eager to profess their ignorance. As the rain intensified and the wind tugged at my overcoat, I allowed myself a private smile. Here was the perfect blend of petty secrets, domestic theatre, and social pretense, a tangled skein for which my talents had been, shall we say, rather cruelly wasted on lighter cases until now. The coach rattled away from the station, and as the village of Bleatmarsh slid by in a grey, indistinct blur, I settled into my seat with the air of a man prepared to probe beneath the respectable veneer, and, with any luck, to emerge both enlightened and dry, though the latter seemed less probable. The chair was still warm indeed, and so, with that, the game was afoot. The Runcible estate stood perched on the cliffside like a stubborn old relic, stubbornly resisting the modern world, as much as its late mistress had resisted anything approaching sentimentality. Its weathered stone walls bore the patina of centuries, and the faint brine of the sea seemed to cling to the very mortar between the bricks. The garden, once a source of quiet pride, now resembled a tangled confusion of overgrown hedges and rusted iron gates, as if nature itself had conspired to reclaim the land from human pretensions. As we entered the dim hallway, the heavy scent of pipe tobacco mingled uneasily with something faintly metallic, a scent that, I noted with some satisfaction, bespoke of trouble far greater than mere domestic strife. Reverend Pettigrew muttered about the oddities he had already encountered since arriving, the housekeeper's nervous glances, the butler's clipped replies, the missing silver tray that no one would admit to having seen. It was, in short, the sort of domestic unraveling that promised nothing less than a fine puzzle. Our first interview was with Mrs. Gladys Cribbs, the housekeeper, a formidable woman whose uniform was as immaculately pressed as her manner was austere. She greeted us with the sort of solemnity reserved for church funerals and tax collectors. "I was in the kitchen all evening, my lord," she declared, And I can swear I heard no quarrels, no strangers. Mrs. Runcible was quite her usual self, except perhaps a bit more pensive than usual. Pensive, you say? I queried, noting the slight falter in her voice. Do elaborate, Mrs. Cribbs. The tiniest detail may prove of use. She hesitated, adjusting her starched collar with a certain dignity. Miss Runcible, the niece, mentioned a letter that evening. The solicitor's letter, I believe. Mrs. Runcible was expecting it to settle certain matters. She was quite agitated about it, more than I have ever seen her. Pettigrew interjected. Did anyone else come or go that evening? Mrs. Cribbs's eyes narrowed. No one unusual, sir. The gardener, Mr. Henshaw, left at 6. The butler, Mr. Bartholomew, was in the study before supper, but left promptly at 9. I was in the kitchen, and Miss Runcible retired early. Miss Runcible retired early, I repeated. A curious coincidence with the time of death. Yes, sir, she said, though Miss Runcible claims to have been in her room reading. And what of the servants' quarters? Any unusual noises? Any comings or goings? She shook her head firmly. No, my lord. The staff are as loyal as ever. I should know. Anyone out of line would find themselves at the street in a trice. Loyalty in the domestic sphere, I reflected, is often less a matter of affection than of fear or convenience. I made a mental note to speak with the butler and gardener in turn, for servants often hold truths in shadows they dare not expose in daylight. We were ushered next to the butler, Mr. Bartholomew, a tall, gaunt man with eyes sharp enough to cut glass, but a mouth tightly sealed as if by iron bands. His demeanour suggested a man accustomed to control, both of the household and, perhaps, of the information flow. Mr. Bartholomew, I began. You were in the study until 9 o'clock, yes? That is correct, my lord. I had just finished arranging the papers for the solicitor's visit. Mrs. Runcible insisted on reviewing them personally. I left as soon as she retired. And did you notice anything unusual about Mrs. Runcible's demeanour? He considered this carefully. She was, if I might say, distracted. There was an undercurrent of worry, but no overt distress. Did you hear voices? Any altercation? No, my lord. The house is large, but the study is somewhat isolated. I heard only the ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of the floorboards. The clock, I murmured. That stopped. At 7 minutes past 9, did it not? Indeed, Bartholomew confirmed, though I had not thought much of it at the time. It is an old clock, prone to irregularities. Yet the exact moment it stopped coincides with the time of death. Curious, is it not? He nodded slowly, but said no more. The gardener, Mr. Henshaw, was next, a ruddy-faced, sturdy man with hands roughened by toil. His loyalty, like most in service, was to the land and the routines it demanded, not to the humans it sustained. Henshaw, you left the estate at 6 o'clock, you say? That's right, sir. I was done with my rounds for the day. Saw nothing out of the ordinary. Did you see Miss Runcible about the grounds? Miss Runcible? No, sir. She tends to keep to herself, spends most time in the West Wing. Any visitors or strangers? Not a one, sir. The only people about were the usual servants and Mrs. Runcible herself. I leaned forward slightly. And the weather? This fog, the damp? Made it hard to see anything clearly after dusk, sir. Quiet, too. No sounds of voices or quarrels. I filed this away as expected, yet it was a detail that began to stitch itself into the larger tapestry. The fog, the stillness, the isolation of the house. An ideal cover for subtle movements, for secrets to slip unseen. The niece, Miss Beatrice Runcible, was the final person we saw before the evening. A pale, rather withdrawn young woman, with eyes that flickered like candlelight, too quick to betray nervousness, too guarded to trust. She insisted she had little to do with the day's events beyond fetching the solicitor's letter. I was in my room reading, she told us, voice low. I heard voices, my aunt and someone else, but I couldn't make out the words. Voices. I said, arching an eyebrow. "And did you think to investigate?" "No, it was late. I did not want to intrude." "Prudent," I said, but I suspected more than simple propriety kept her from that study door. "I cannot imagine who would harm my aunt," she added quickly. "She had her difficulties, yes, but no enemies." Yet the uneasy glance she cast toward the study told a different story, one of secrets kept under lock and key. As we left the room, Pettigrew sighed. "What do you make of it, Lord Peter? Everyone is impeccably certain of their ignorance." "Ah, Pettigrew," I said with a faint smile, "ignorance is seldom as simple as it sounds. It is often a carefully constructed edifice supported by half-truths and omissions. And in such houses as this, where hierarchy governs speech and silence alike, the truth tends to hide in the very details the servants dismiss, such as clock stopping, missing trays, open windows. Precisely. Trivial until they are not. The clock, for example. Why stop exactly when it did? And the open window despite the chill? What was the purpose? And for whom was it left ajar? We retired early that evening, the house settling into its habitual groans and sighs, as if whispering secrets to itself. I found myself drawn back to the study, where the chair had indeed been left warm. Sitting there briefly, I noted the faint imprint on the leather, a subtle indentation, as though the victim had only just vacated the seat. The letter was missing, or so it seemed from the disarray of papers on the desk, and the peculiar scent, mingling tobacco with something faintly metallic, suggested the presence of another, someone who had left hurriedly. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters and the fog crept like a living thing against the panes, I considered the day's interviews. Each witness, loyal or frightened, had in some way revealed a sliver of truth veiled in reticence. The servant's oath of ignorance was a cloak, and beneath it lurked contradictions I intended to unravel. For all the genteel airs and faded grandeur, Bleatmarsh was a village girded in silence and shadow, and the case of Mrs. Runcible's death was only beginning to unfold. Tomorrow, I decided, would bring more questions, and I hoped answers disguised as irrelevancies. After all, the devil, as always, was in the details. Morning at Runcible House arrived not with the usual chirrup of songbirds, but under a sullen canopy of mist, the kind that drapes the world in a damp grey veil and muffles the sharp edges of reality. I found myself nursing a cup of rather weak tea in the drawing-room, the fire flickering uncertainly, as if hesitant to offer warmth to a house steeped in unease. Reverend Pettigrew was already busy taking notes, his brow furrowed in a manner that suggested the clerical mind was grappling with something beyond mere parish affairs. Our first task was to revisit the physical setting of the crime. Details, I reminded myself, were the sinews of any sound deduction. The study itself was a small chamber, lined with well-thumbed volumes and dark wood panelling, but its air was oppressively still, disturbed only by the faint scent of tobacco and something metallic I could not yet name. The window, which Miss Beatrice had described as open despite the chill, was indeed ajar, the latch twisted slightly, as if hurriedly released. "Curious," I murmured, crouching to inspect the heavy leather chair, still marked by the faint indentation of a recent occupant. My gloved fingers brushed against a thin scattering of ash on the nearby carpet, no sign of a match or pipe, yet unmistakably tobacco residue. "Not a smoker, I gather," Pettigrew said. "Nor Mrs. Runcible, certainly," I agreed. "Yet someone who left behind a ghost, it seems." Turning my attention to the clock, I noticed that the hands were frozen. But more interestingly, the mechanism had clearly stopped cleanly, as if the power had been interrupted rather than simply winding down. A peculiar mechanical quirk, perhaps, but the timing aligned ominously with the estimated moment of death. "Mrs. Cribbs mentioned a missing silver tray," I said aloud, "and yet the servants professed to no knowledge of its whereabouts." Bartholomew's clipped manner came back to me, how he had spoken of papers and order, but not of the domestic implements. I made a mental note to return to the servants' quarters later. Loyalty, after all, often masked a tangled web of alliances and grudges. Walking to the window, I glanced out over the garden, the twisted hedgerows and skeletal trees bending under the damp weight of the morning. The garden gate was shut firmly, and no footprints disturbed the dew-sodden gravel, a fact that suggested no visitor had entered or left unseen since the previous evening. The domestic staff's sworn ignorance became less convincing as I began to align their statements with physical evidence. The gardener's absence at 6 o'clock had been noted, but was it the last movement of any person besides the victim and the servants? Miss Beatrice's claim of hearing voices but declining to investigate struck me as well. Was she simply polite, or was there a more subtle motivation for her reticence? The anxiety flickering behind her eyes spoke volumes, though carefully shielded by youth and propriety. I turned my attention next to the letter, the solicitor's letter, which seemed to occupy a position central to the mystery. If the letter had been received and discussed, its contents might have triggered events leading to death. Yet the study was in disarray, papers strewn as though in haste, and the letter itself was conspicuously absent. "Pettigrew," I said, "we must inquire of the solicitor, Mr. Hargraves, first thing. A letter of such importance may well contain clues not found within these walls." The vicar nodded solemnly, and together we set about interviewing the staff once more, this time with a focus sharpened by the morning's reflections. Mrs. Cribbs remained steadfast in her narrative, yet I detected a slight tremor when questioned about the silver tray. "I saw it last in the dining room, sir," she said, "but after supper I cannot say where it went. It is not the sort of thing to vanish on its own." "And yet it has vanished," I observed dryly. "A peculiar theft, considering the household's modest means." Bartholomew, summoned again, revealed a flash of irritation when questioned about the tray. "It was placed beside the study door after tea," he admitted grudgingly. "I presumed it remained there until morning." "A tray by the door," I repeated thoughtfully. "And no one saw it later?" His silence was eloquent. Mr. Henshaw, the gardener, proved equally taciturn, though a chance observation caught my attention. When asked about the times of movements, he mentioned hearing the church bells ring sharply at 9 o'clock, an hour notable for Mrs. Runsible's expected receipt of the solicitor's letter. Yet he also spoke of an odd delay in the bell's echo, as if the fog swallowed the sound unevenly. Soundproofing oddities, indeed. The study's location, isolated from the rest of the house, coupled with the muffled echoes of the bells, suggested a calculated awareness of timing. A murder committed to coincide with the chiming of a clock, a window deliberately left open to mislead, and a chair warm enough to deceive the casual observer. As the morning waned, I requested to speak again with Miss Beatrice, whose earlier reticence now seemed tinged with fear rather than mere decorum. Her responses were measured but carefully guarded. "I heard voices," she admitted, "but I did not recognize the second voice. My aunt spoke with authority, but the other was quieter, almost pleading." "Pleading, you say? And did this voice remind you of anyone in the household?" She shook her head. "No, my lord. It was unfamiliar." I pressed further. "And your aunt, did she seem afraid?" Beatrice hesitated. "No, but troubled, more than usual. A psychological undercurrent began to surface. This was no simple quarrel over money or inheritance, but a matter entangled with personal fears and unspoken tensions." In the late afternoon, we received a dispatch from Mr. Hargraves, the solicitor. The letter he had sent was brief, confirming only that Mrs. Runcible was to receive final documents regarding the settlement of her late husband's estate, a considerable sum held in trust. It was to be read in private, with no other witnesses. Private reading, yet no letter to hand. The plot thickened. As dusk fell and the fog curled thick against the windows, I found myself pondering the layered contradictions: the servant's silence, the missing tray, the stopped clock, and the open window. Each seemed trivial in isolation, yet together they wove a pattern demanding scrutiny. The house's ancient timbers groaned under the weight of secrets, and I, Lord Peter Wimsey, intended to listen closely. Somewhere within this labyrinth of loyalty and fear lay the kernel of truth, and I was nothing if not patient. The devil, after all, was in the details. The following morning dawned with a brittle chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of Runible House, the fog having thinned to a mere veil that still muffled the world beyond the estate's gates. After a brisk breakfast, during which the servants displayed a studied normality tinged with barely concealed anxiety, I resolved to revisit the study once more, this time accompanied by Reverend Pettigrew and, at my suggestion, the local constable. The goal was to examine more minutely the scene where Mrs. Runible had met her untimely end, to seek overlooked details that might elucidate the tangled web of contradictions. The study, bathed in pale morning light that lent its dark panelling, an austere clarity revealed itself anew through the lens of fresh inquiry. I took particular note of the window still open despite the morning's chill. The latch bore faint fingerprints, smudged and uneven, suggesting haste rather than care. The sash hung slightly askew, a subtle sign that it had been manipulated, with some urgency. Turning to the leather chair, I pressed gently against the indentation left by the victim, which, while fading, remained discernible. Nearby, the scattered papers were re-examined, most notably the absence of the solicitor's letter, which seemed a deliberate omission rather than an accident. The scattered ash on the carpet was faint but present, an ephemeral footprint of an unseen visitor. Pettigrew, I mused aloud. Tell me, what do you make of the timing of the church bells? Our gardener mentioned a peculiar delay in their echo. The vicar furrowed his brow. Indeed, Lord Peter, the fog does strange things to sound. I have noticed the bell tolls at the parish many times, and this muffled effect is not entirely unfamiliar, but it might provide cover for an act of subtle timing. Precisely, I said. If a murder were to be timed to coincide with the bell's toll, it would afford a most useful auditory mask. Constable Harris, a practical man, nodded. Sounds travel oddly in fog. Could be the killer took advantage of that. I took a step back, allowing the weight of these observations to settle before turning to a more unexpected clue: the missing silver tray. Returning to the butler's earlier admission that it had been left near the study door after tea, I decided to investigate the corridor adjoining the study. The corridor was narrow, lined with faded tapestries, and bore the marks of heavy foot traffic. Near the study door, a faint scuff mark on the polished floor caught my eye, a disturbance inconsistent with normal passage. I knelt and examined the mark, noting the pattern of dust and slight abrasions that suggested something heavy had been dragged. Miss Cribbs, I said upon summoning the housekeeper once more, I understand the silver tray was last seen near this door. She nodded cautiously. Yes, my lord, but I cannot say who moved it after. Does the tray bear any marks or peculiarities? Only that it is an old piece passed down through the family for generations. I considered the possibility that the tray, a heavy silver object, might have been used in the act of murder or to conceal evidence. The idea that it was moved after the crime suggested an attempt to alter the scene. Later, I turned my attention to Miss Beatrice Runcible's unusual behaviour. Her earlier admission of overhearing voices but failing to investigate gnawed at me. There was something amiss in her guardedness, an invisible line she dared not cross. With a tone both gentle and probing, I asked, Miss Runible, you mentioned a second voice in your aunt's presence that evening. Can you recall anything of its nature? Pitch, accent, any peculiarities? Her eyes flickered with hesitation. It was quiet, almost pleading, as I said. The tone was not one I recognized. Did your aunt react with alarm? Not exactly. Alarm, more troubled, yet controlled. Did you see anyone enter or leave the study that evening? No. The house was silent. Her carefully measured responses suggested concealment, but of what, I could not yet say. As the day wore on, the solicitor's letter continued to puzzle us. A subsequent message from Mr. Hargraves revealed it was a notification of a final financial settlement intended to be delivered and read solely to Mrs. Runible. The absence of the letter raised the question of whether it had ever been received. My thoughts returned again to the stopped clock. An antique regulator, it was prone to eccentricities, but the precise stoppage at 9:07 was suspiciously convenient. Was it a device to provide a false timestamp, or had it stopped naturally? The clock's internal mechanism was to be examined by a specialist. As evening approached, I summoned all present to the drawing room under the pretext of a casual gathering. Observing the subtle interactions, the glances, the stiff postures, the carefully concealed anxieties, I noted the faintest trace of a shared secret among them. There was Mr. Bartholomew standing a little too rigidly, eyes flicking toward the door. Mrs. Cribbs, whose expression was that of one who has tasted suspicion before and finds it bitter. The gardener, who avoided eye contact. And, of course, Miss Beatrice, pale and guarded. An odd household, I remarked aloud, where the furniture appears less disturbed than the tempers. A small murmur rippled among the servants. Now I understand there is a curious family history here, I said, turning to Pettigrew. Something about a previous scandal? The vicar nodded. Indeed, Mrs. Runcible's late husband was involved, in a rather notorious affair some years ago, a business failure that left the family fortunes in precarious balance. And this, I said, may explain the solicitor's letter, perhaps final arrangements to secure the estate's future. But who benefits most? Pettigrew asked. That was the question that lingered like smoke in the room. Later, alone with Pettigrew, I considered the psychology of the household. Mrs. Runcible's manner, aloof yet tense, suggested a woman, used to control, but now confronted by forces beyond her command. The servant's taciturnity betrayed fear, or worse, complicity. Reverend, I said, it seems to me that the victim's death is less about money and more about control. Who holds it, who loses it, and who dares to grasp for it in desperation? He nodded gravely. A tangled web indeed, Lord Peter. As night enveloped Runible House once more, I prepared to delve deeper, certain that the truth lurked in those subtle contradictions. The misplaced tray, the stopped clock, the window left open against the cold fog, and the elusive voice that had stirred Miss Beatrice from her slumber. The stage was set, the players assembled, and I, as ever, would watch and listen until the faintest thread revealed the knot. The hours that followed were a careful dance of subtle inquiry and measured observation. Runible House, in all its gloomy splendor, seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that its secrets were being prized loose, one careful word and quiet glance at a time. I found myself drawn once again to the servants' quarters, where reticence and loyalty wove a tangled veil over the truth. Mrs. Cribbs, in particular, exhibited a quiet tension that I believed could be unraveled with the right combination of patience and pointed questioning. There was something almost perfunctory in her declarations of ignorance, as if her lips were rehearsed to shield a deeper knowledge. Mrs. Cribbs, I began, seated opposite her in the dim kitchen, you have served this household long, have you not? Near on 15 years, my lord, she replied, fingers twitching with a nervous energy she barely concealed. And in all that time, has anything unusual ever occurred here? Anything that gave you pause? Her eyes darted to the window, the shadows beyond as dark as her thoughts. The house has its moods, sir, but unusual, I can't rightly say. Folks in a house like this carry their troubles close. It's not my place to pry. Indeed, Mrs. Cribbs, yet even the smallest detail can be of service to an investigator. For instance, the night of Mrs. Runsible's death. Did you notice anyone acting out of character? Any sound, any movement? She hesitated, then in a voice barely above a whisper said, "I thought I heard footsteps in the corridor just after supper, but I dismissed it as my imagination." Footsteps. Did you see who it was? No, my lord. The hall was dark. But the steps were soft, hurried, and stopped abruptly near the study. This revelation stirred a new suspicion. A quiet visitor, slipping through the shadows. I proceeded to question Bartholomew again, whose officious manner belied a keen awareness of the household's undercurrents. His initial defensiveness gave way under gentle scrutiny. "The silver tray, Mr. Bartholomew," I pressed. "You said it was left by the study door after tea. Are you certain it remained there until the morning?" He shifted uneasily. I cannot be positive, my lord. There was a moment when I was called away to attend to a phone call. When I returned, the tray was not in sight." "A phone call? At what time?" "Shortly after 8 o'clock. That detail caught my interest. A call at 8 o'clock followed by the disappearance of the tray, footsteps near the study corridor. These threads demanded weaving into a coherent fabric. Later I was drawn back to the question of the clocks. The stopped clock in the study was unusual enough. But what of the other timepieces in the house? I requested that Pettigrew and the constable assist in comparing their settings. In the hallway, the grandfather clock chimed the hour. 10 o'clock, loud and clear, its pendulum swinging steadily. The kitchen clock, however, lagged behind. By nearly 5 minutes, its hands stubbornly stuck at 8:15. "How curious," I remarked. "A house with discordant timekeeping is a house ripe for deception." The practical constable frowned. "But what use is a slow clock?" "In a murder, Lord Peter. A subtle one, constable." "It can provide an alibi, a cover for movements in the shadows. If one can control perceptions of time, one can control testimony." It was then that I considered the echoes of the church bells, their muffled resonance swallowed by the fog. Timing the murder to coincide with their toll could provide auditory camouflage, while clocks set awry would further confuse witnesses. As evening settled once more, I found myself speaking privately with Miss Beatrice. Her earlier reticence had softened into a hesitant cooperation, though shadows still clung to her words. "Miss Runsibble," I said gently, "you mentioned your aunt was troubled yet controlled. Did you notice anything peculiar in her behavior these last days? Any visitors or letters that might have disturbed her?" She bit her lip. She was worried about something, yes, but she never said what. "There was a man, Mr. Hargraves, the solicitor. She was anxious to receive his letter. She hoped it would bring resolution." "Did she seem afraid of anyone?" "No, not afraid. More burdened, as though carrying a weight she could not share." This psychological glimpse suggested the victim's death was entangled not merely in financial matters, but in private fears and unspoken burdens. I retired to my rooms that night, mulling over the day's revelations. The puzzle pieces, the missing tray, the manipulated clocks, the footsteps in the corridor, the muffled bells, and the unseen letter, all formed a delicate lattice of intrigue. The question remained, who among the household had the means, motive, and opportunity to strike with such calculated precision, and what was the true nature of the secret Mrs. Runsibble bore so heavily? Sleep evaded me, as it often did when the mind was seized by the chase. Somewhere in the house's gloom lay the key, a detail so subtle that it had been overlooked until now. Tomorrow, I would return to the study, to the servants, and to the very fabric of time itself within Runsibble House. For in this game, the smallest detail could unravel the entire mystery. The morning mist clung to the edges of Runible House, like a reluctant mourner, unwilling to let go of the secret steeped in its stones. I rose early, compelled by an almost instinctive certainty that the key to the mystery lay hidden not in grand gestures, but in the minutiae of the household's daily rhythms. The interplay of time and perception had emerged as a leitmotif, and so I resolved to examine the clocks more thoroughly, alongside the seemingly innocuous servants' routines. First, I called upon the clockmaker from the nearby village, a stooped man with keen eyes and nimble fingers, who proceeded to dismantle the study's antique regulator before my very eyes. The pendulum, I noted with interest, was precisely balanced, its motion smooth with no sign of tampering, yet the stoppage at 9:07 remained an enigma. "Lord Peter," he said, "this clock is a temperamental creature. Often a hairline fissure in the escapement or a slight bend in a gear can cause sudden halts. However, no such damage is apparent here. That suggests the stoppage was deliberate or coincidental with an external factor. Indeed, my lord, if the clock was left untouched, it should keep perfect time. Thank you, Mr. Bellamy. Your expertise is invaluable." With the clockmaker's observations in mind, I shifted my focus to the other timepieces in the house. The grandfather clock in the hall, as noted, was striking correctly, while the kitchen clock lagged notably. I had asked Mrs. Cribbs whether she or the servants ever adjusted the clocks, but her answers remained vague and evasive. It was then I turned my attention to the household's daily schedule, particularly the servants' habits and movements on the evening of Mrs. Runsible's death. I found the gardener, a taciturn man named Davies, tending to the frost-kissed hedges, and pressed him gently on his whereabouts and observations. "Mr. Davies, did you happen to notice any unusual comings or goings after supper yesterday?" He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Not much, my lord. Except the butler seemed in a hurry, and I heard voices down by the study, low and hurried." "Voices?" "Aye, sir. I thought it odd, but I kept my distance." This corroborated Mrs. Cribbs's testimony about footsteps and voices near the study, lending weight to the notion of a clandestine meeting or confrontation. Later, I returned to the study, this time scrutinizing the window with renewed purpose. The latch, as before, showed signs of recent use. A faint trace of soil on the windowsill suggested someone had leaned there or perhaps entered or exited through it. "Miss Runcible," I asked quietly when she entered the room, "have you ever left this window open intentionally?" She glanced, at the sill, then away. "Only on warm days, Lord Peter. Not on such a chilly evening." I noted her discomfort. "Would it surprise you to learn that the window was left ajar during the night of your aunt's death?" She faltered. I did not know." This small admission added a new dimension, the window as a possible ingress or egress route, bypassing the front door and potentially the watchful eyes of the household. The solicitor's letter remained a thorny mystery. I had learned from Mr. Hargraves that it was delivered by hand to the house in the early afternoon, yet the servant who accepted it was never identified. The letter's disappearance was as troubling as it was suspicious. In the drawing room that afternoon, I gathered the household once more under a pretense of casual conversation, observing as the shadows played across their faces. My intent was to watch their reactions to a subtle provocation. "Miss Beatrice," I said lightly, "I trust you have read the solicitor's letter by now." She stiffened. "I have not." A ripple of surprise passed through the group. "And, pray, how is that possible? The letter was delivered yesterday." She looked down. "I was not allowed to see it." "Not allowed?" Mrs. Runcible insisted it was private. A murmur arose, and I seized the moment. Curious, is it not, that such a letter should be withheld? One might speculate on its contents. Mr. Bartholomew cleared his throat. "Speculation does little for the investigation, Lord Peter." "Perhaps not," I agreed, "but sometimes it's speculation that reveals character." The atmosphere grew taut. I pressed further. "Miss Beatrice, you mentioned hearing a voice, one not your aunt's, on that fateful evening." Can you now recall anything more? Her eyes met mine with a flicker of defiance. It was Mr. Hargraves. Indeed. And what brought him to the house at such an hour? She hesitated, then whispered. He came after the letter was delivered. He wanted to speak with my aunt privately. This revelation cast new light upon the solicitor's role and suggested that the letter was not merely routine, but pivotal. That night, I paced the dim corridors of Runible House, turning over the tangled threads in my mind. The missing letter, the open window, the clock that stopped at a precise moment, all pointed toward a carefully orchestrated plan. More troubling still was the psychological dimension emerging from Miss Beatrice's guardedness and the household's collective unease. The victim had been carrying a secret burden, one that evidently invited intrusion and ultimately violence. Just before retiring, I stopped once more at the study window, now closed and locked. Outside, the moon cast a cold silver light upon the dew-soaked lawn, and I fancied I could detect faint footprints leading away toward the dense undergrowth. I resolved to examine these tracks at first light, for in the quietest detail, the whisper of a footprint, the faintest mark on a latch, lay the path to truth. Tomorrow would bring fresh questions, and I, Lord Peter Wimsey, would ensure that no shadow went unilluminated. The dawn arrived grey and mist-laden, a fitting cloak for the secrets that clung to Runible House like ivy on crumbling stone. The footprints I had glimpsed the night before were indeed there, faint impressions pressed into the sodden earth, leading away from the study window toward the copse of yew trees that bordered the estate. I summoned Davies, the gardener, and together we traced the path, mindful of disturbing the fragile evidence. Curious, Davies murmured. They look like a woman's, small and light. Exactly so, I agreed, crouching to inspect the prints more closely. And the angle here suggests a hurried retreat, footsteps uneven, as if the wearer was anxious or encumbered. We followed the trail until it disappeared beneath a tangle of brambles. Beyond lay the lane to the village, no more than a mile, distant. Returning to the house, I resolved to speak again with Miss Beatrice, whose evasion continued to frustrate yet fascinate. I found her in the conservatory, a fragile figure amidst the winter-dormant ferns and dusty glass. Miss Runible, I said, taking a seat opposite her, it would serve us both if you were candid. I know the burden you carry is heavy, but the truth will set us free. She looked up, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. It's not easy, Lord Peter. My aunt, she had secrets, not just about money or debts, but about people. People I thought I knew. Indeed? She nodded. There was someone, a visitor she never spoke of in front of the household, a man who came late at night once or twice. I never met him, but she seemed frightened. Do you know his name? Her gaze dropped. No. But I found a letter in her desk, hidden beneath a false bottom. It mentioned the name Elliot. The name struck a chord. Elliot. I believe I have heard. It mentioned in passing, we must learn more. Before I could press further, Bartholomew entered with a summons from Inspector Parker. There was to be a meeting in the library at noon to discuss the emerging facts and to hear Lord Peter's impressions. In the interim, I examined Mrs. Runcible's desk, paying particular attention to the false bottom mentioned by Miss Beatrice. It was a clever contrivance, requiring deft manipulation to reveal a hidden compartment. Within, I discovered the letter, carefully folded, sealed with a dark, red wax stamp. The handwriting was precise, the ink faded but legible. It was from the solicitor, Mr. Hargraves, addressed to Mrs. Runible. The tone was formal but hinted at urgency. Dear Mrs. Runible, I enclose herein the final terms of the agreement with Mr. Elliot, which must be signed without delay. I trust you understand the gravity of the matter and the need for discretion. Yours faithfully, C.J. Hargraves. Yes, sir. The contents suggested a financial or legal arrangement tied to this elusive Mr. Elliot. Yet what exactly remained obscured. At noon, the library was filled with a palpable tension. Inspector Parker, a man of robust frame and cautious demeanour, greeted me with a nod. "Lord Peter," he began, "we have questioned the household again. The servants remain steadfast in their silence, but your inquiries have shaken some loose." I nodded. "Indeed, Inspector. I have reason to believe that the letter delivered yesterday afternoon is central to this affair, and that the name Elliot may hold the key." "Elliot? We have no one by that name in the immediate circle. Nor, apparently, is he to be found locally. I propose a discreet inquiry into this individual's background." Beatrice sat quietly, clutching her handkerchief. "I do not know who he is, but I fear the connection between him and my aunt was fraught with peril." "Peril is a word to ponder carefully," I mused. "But first, we must test the timelines once more." I outlined the series of events as best as they had been recorded: the letter's delivery in the early afternoon, the butler's phone call at 8, the stopping of the study clock at 7 minutes past 9, the muffled church bells at 10. "Something does not quite fit," I said. "The clocks, as we have seen, are not in harmony, and the servants' recollections of time are vague at best. Could it be that the murder was timed to exploit this confusion?" Inspector Parker frowned. "That would be clever, though cruel." "Precisely. And we must remember the footsteps near the study and the footprints outside the window. It appears the killer was no stranger to the house. And yet," the inspector added, "no one has reported anyone leaving or entering after supper, which suggests that the killer was someone inside or closely connected to the household." A sudden thought struck me. "Has anyone accounted for the contents of the silver tray?" Bartholomew stiffened. The tray was missing from its usual place after tea, but I had not thought it relevant. On the contrary, a missing tray could mean the removal of evidence or a message left behind. The inspector looked intrigued. "We will search the house for it." The search proved fruitless. Yet as I examined the tray's usual resting place, I noticed a faint smudge on the polished surface of the mahogany sideboard, an impression of a ring, or perhaps a small seal. "Interesting," I remarked. "A mark left in haste." The afternoon waned, and I spent a quiet hour alone in the drawing room, reflecting upon the web of clues. The psychological aspect of the crime now pressed upon me. A woman burdened by secrets, a mysterious visitor named Elliot, a letter withheld from all but a select few. I resolved to find out more about this Elliot and to confirm the authenticity and timing of the solicitor's letter. As twilight deepened, Miss Beatrice returned to the subject of her aunt's fears. She confided in me once, in a moment of weakness, said she feared that the past would come back to claim her. What past, I do not know, but there was something, an old grievance, a debt of honor perhaps, that weighed upon her. Or a threat, I said quietly. The evening concluded with a renewed sense of urgency. The house itself seemed to pulse with unspoken words, each room a silent witness to the unfolding tragedy. Tomorrow would bring new inquiries and, I hoped, the final unraveling of the mystery. For in the interplay of time, shadow, and human frailty, the truth waited patiently to be revealed. The morning found me at the Runible house postern, where the damp earth had preserved the faintest traces of last night's footsteps. Davies was already there, patiently marking the trail with small twigs to preserve the integrity of the prints until I might have the opportunity to examine them more closely with suitable tools. The evidence was fragile, but it was enough to confirm what I had suspected. The footprints were small, light, and hurriedly retraced the route from the study window toward the lane. A woman, or someone masquerading as one, had slipped out under the cover of darkness. Turning away from the earth, my thoughts returned to the solicitor's letter and the mysterious Mr. Elliot. The urgency with which Mrs. Runcible was urged to sign the enclosed terms hinted at more than a mere legal formality. There was a hidden drama, something festering beneath the polished surface of the household's orderly facade. But what? I requested Bartholomew to produce all correspondence and documents relating to the Elliot affair. As he laid the papers before me, I noted one envelope distinctly separate from the rest, smaller, sealed with the same dark red wax, yet unsigned. Inside, a letter addressed to Mrs. Runcible from a local magistrate's office, warning of an impending summons in a matter of some delicacy. The handwriting was familiar, Mr. Hargraves's, but the tone was strained, almost pleading. "Dear Mrs. Runcible, it is with regret that I must inform you of the magistrate's decision to proceed with charges relating to the contested estate. You are advised to appear forthwith to avoid further complications. Yours, C.J. Hargraves." The charge remained unspecified, but the implications were clear. Mrs. Runcible was embroiled in a legal struggle that risked scandal and loss. The gravity of this revelation deepened when I considered Beatrice's earlier confession about her aunt's secret fears. The shadows of the past were not merely metaphorical. Later, I sought out Mr. Hargraves himself, who had been summoned to the village but kept a discreet distance from the household. I found him in a modest chambers above the local post office, a man whose careful grooming and precise manner betrayed a disposition both meticulous and cautious. "Mr. Hargraves," I began, "your correspondence reveals more than mere legal entanglement. Can you enlighten me on the nature of the case involving Mrs. Runcible?" He sighed, placing a heavy hand on the desk. "Lord Peter, the matter concerns an inheritance dispute. Mrs. Runcible's late husband left certain assets in trust, with conditions that some parties, namely Mr. Elliot, have contested. And Mr. Elliot is a distant relation, claiming a rightful share. The case has become acrimonious, with threats made and reputations at stake." I nodded. "And the letter you delivered, the one urging prompt signing?" "A settlement offer to avoid public proceedings." Mrs. Runcible was hesitant, fearing exposure. "Did you notice anything unusual during your visit to Runcible House yesterday?" He hesitated. There was tension, certainly. Mrs. Runcible seemed distracted, anxious, and I thought I heard voices in the study later that evening, though. I had retired early. "Voices?" "Yes, but I cannot say who they belonged to." His testimony confirmed the presence of a private meeting, potentially involving the letter's contents. Returning to the house, I summoned Miss Beatrice once more, gently pressing for the identity of the mysterious visitor who had haunted her aunt's last days. I cannot say for certain," she admitted, "but I suspect it was Mr. Elliot himself." Her voice trembled, and I observed a flicker of guilt or fear. "If that is so," I said, "then the motive for murder might be rooted not only in legal conflict, but in personal confrontation." The pieces began to coalesce into a clearer picture. A woman trapped between a threatening past, the pressure of legal warfare, and the suffocating demands of her household. I turned my attention next to the butler, Bartholomew, whose precise movements and occasional stony expressions had aroused my suspicion. He was present during the delivery of the solicitor's letter, yet failed to mention who accepted it. I found him polishing silver in the sideboard room, methodical and unhurried. "Bartholomew," I said casually, "who received Mr. Hargraves's letter yesterday?" He paused, glancing up with a faint trace of irritation. "I did, my lord. It was left with me as usual." "And the silver tray on which it was placed? Was it returned after?" "No, sir. The tray was taken away to be cleaned, as I recall." "Odd," I mused, "for such a letter to disappear without record." He shrugged. Perhaps misplaced, my lord. I allowed the matter to rest for the moment, sensing a reticence that warranted careful coaxing rather than confrontation. The most telling moment came when I revisited the study to recreate the timeline of that evening. If the clock had stopped at 9:07 p.m. and the butler's phone call occurred at 8 p.m., then there was a crucial half-hour unaccounted for. The muffled church bells at 10 also suggested a discrepancy, as did the servants' inconsistent recollections of supper and bedtimes. I requested to see the kitchen clock and noticed at once that it lagged several minutes behind the hall clock. This small detail, previously dismissed, hinted at deliberate manipulation. Could it be that the killer had arranged the clocks to confuse alibis and conceal movements? More curiously, the window latch bore faint traces of a crimson stain, distinct from the general dust and soil. I collected a sample discreetly for analysis. That evening, as a chill wind whispered through the bare branches outside, I gathered the household in the drawing room once again. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and guarded glances. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "we have before us a puzzle of time, secrecy, and concealed truths. The murder of Mrs. Runible was not a crime of passion, but a calculated act executed to exploit the frailties of human memory and the fallibility of clocks." A ripple passed through the group. "I ask you all to consider. Who stood to gain from her death, and who possessed the knowledge and opportunity to manipulate these elements?" Miss Beatrice's face paled. "I only want the truth," she whispered. "As do I," I replied softly. "And we are close, very close." The night deepened, shadows lengthening like fingers across the polished floorboards. Somewhere a clock chimed the hour, its tone mournful and final, and in that moment I knew the unveiling was at hand. The weight of the evening pressed upon us, the dim gaslight casting long shadows that danced with quiet menace along the drawing-room walls. I could sense the subtle shifts in posture and exchanged glances. Everyone was acutely aware that the balance of this investigation was about to tip, yet none wished to be the first to fall. "Before we proceed," I said, allowing my voice to cut through the murmurs, "there is one piece of evidence I have yet to share with you all." From my pocket I produced a small envelope. This was found near the study window where the footprints began. A scrap of paper, folded hastily and discarded, bearing a single word: trust. A hush settled over the room. Miss Beatrice's eyes fixed on the scrap as if it were a talisman, and Bartholomew's grip tightened on the arm of his chair. I continued, "I believe this is a message, left deliberately by either the murderer or the victim, one of desperation, or perhaps a veiled accusation." Inspector Parker cleared his throat. "A cryptic note indeed. But what relevance can it hold?" "Everything," I replied. "For trust, or its breach, is the heart of this mystery." I then addressed the assembled party more directly. "We have established that Mrs. Runible was entangled in a legal dispute with one Mr. Elliot, whose identity and presence remain shrouded in secrecy. We know she feared the past, and that this fear was not unfounded. We have discrepancies in the timing of events on the night of the murder, inconsistencies in clocks and testimony alike, and a missing silver tray that might have carried more than just letters." Turning to Beatrice, I pressed gently, "You have mentioned your aunt's anxieties. Did she ever speak of anyone in particular who might wish her harm beyond the shadow of this legal battle?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There was one person, her late husband's nephew, Reginald Ashcombe, a man of volatile temper and considerable debts." "And where might we find Mr. Ashcombe now?" I inquired. "Visiting London, as far as I know," she answered. "I see. A convenient absence," I mused aloud. At that moment, Bartholomew cleared his throat, his expression unreadable. "If I may, Lord Peter, There is another matter I believe warrants consideration." He rose, moving to a small side table where a clock stood, its hands frozen at 9:15. "The clocks in the house are set to different times. I have noted this since before Mrs. Runsible's death. The hall clock, the kitchen clock, even the grandfather clock in the library, they do not agree. I suspect it has been deliberate." Nodded approvingly. "Quite right, Bartholomew. Time has been weaponized in this case," Inspector Parker interjected. "But to what end?" "To obscure the precise moment of death, to mislead witnesses, and to create alibis where none should exist," I said. "If we consider the timeline more critically, we realize that the period from 8 o'clock to 9:30 is crucial." I then recounted the events with exactitude, noting the arrival of the solicitor's letter, the presence of the mysterious visitor, the muffled tolling of the church bells, and the final silencing of the study clock. Each fragment is a thread, and when woven together, they form a tapestry of deceit. "Yet," I continued, "there is one witness who has not been heard from, the housekeeper, Mrs. Farnsworth. She has been reticent, but her knowledge of household rhythms is unparalleled." Bartholomew nodded. "She retires early, usually by 9:30, which suggests she might have missed key events in the study." I rose and moved toward the door. "I propose we speak with her at once." The housekeeper was found in her quarters, a small, neatly kept room overlooking the rear gardens. She greeted us with a wary expression but did not refuse. "Mrs. Farnsworth," I began, "I understand your evening habits are regular, but on the night of Mrs. Runsible's death, might you have observed anything unusual?" She shook her head. "No, my lord, I was in bed by 9, but I did hear voices, low and urgent. It was coming from the study." "Voices, male or female?" "Male, mostly. There was a woman too, I think, but it was too faint." "And the timing?" "Shortly after 8, before I went to bed." This aligned with Hargrave's vague recollection of voices. I pressed further. "Did you hear footsteps or the sound of the window being opened?" She looked uncomfortable. "Yes. There was a noise like a latch sliding." "Thank you, Mrs. Farnsworth. Your candor is appreciated." Returning to the drawing room, I assembled the known facts. A clandestine meeting in the study between Mrs. Runsibble and Mr. Hargraves, or perhaps another party. The manipulation of clocks to confuse the timeline. Footprints indicating an escape through the study window. And a missing silver tray that might have been used to transport letters or other incriminating items. But the greatest revelation lay in the psychology of the crime. Mrs. Runsibble was a woman beset by fear and secrets, driven to desperation by threats both legal and personal. The murderer, whoever they were, had exploited this, orchestrating the timing and staging of the crime with chilling precision. It was then that I turned to Bartholomew, whose composed demeanor had not escaped my attention. "Bartholomew, you have served this household faithfully, yet you hold the key to its darkest hour." His eyes flickered momentarily, but he remained still. "Tell me, did you ever observe anything between Mrs. Runsibble and Mr. Elliot, or any other visitor, that might explain a motive beyond the legal?" Bartholomew's voice was steady but laced with irony. "There are things that even the most loyal servant cannot reveal, Lord Peter. But I will say this. Sometimes the greatest betrayals come from those we trust most." A charged silence followed. "I believe," I said softly, "that we are close to unmasking the killer, and that the missing silver tray, the manipulated clocks, and the elusive Mr. Elliot are all pieces of a carefully constructed puzzle." The room seemed to hold its breath. "Tomorrow," I concluded, "we shall revisit the study, retrace every movement, and illuminate the shadows that still linger." As the household dispersed, I remained alone, contemplating the interplay of trust and treachery that had culminated in murder. The game was afoot, and the next moves would reveal not only the culprit, but the dark heart beating beneath the genteel surface of Runible House. The morning light, pale and filtered through the heavy curtains of Runible House, found me once more in the study, a room that now seemed both confining and strangely revealing. The silence was punctuated only by the distant call of a wood pigeon and the occasional scrape of a branch against the window pane, an oddly pastoral counterpoint to the sinister business that had unfolded here. I began my inspection with a renewed eye, measuring once again the minutiae of the room, the arrangement of furniture, the position of the chairs, and, most critically, the state of the window through which the footprints had fled the scene. The latch was indeed worn, and evidence of recent manipulation was unmistakable. Yet what intrigued me most was the slight misalignment of the lock, a detail overlooked by all but the most meticulous observer. Bartholomew, who had been silent until now, observed with a cautious expression. "A cunning mechanism, that, Lord I." Peter. "Difficult to operate unless one is familiar with its particular quirks." "Precisely so," I murmured. "Familiarity with the room and its secrets is a key." Turning my attention to the clock, now restored to its proper time, I noted the face bore a faint scratch near the numeral 8, a subtle damage but potentially meaningful. "This clock has been tampered with," I said, "to slow or hasten its movement, thus aiding the creation of a false timeline." Bartholomew nodded grimly. I knew the clocks were unreliable, but had no notion of their importance. Together we traced the sequence of events, the muffled toll of the church bells, the interval in which the legal letter was delivered, the whispered conversations overheard by the housekeeper, and the peculiar absence of Mrs. Runcible's beloved silver tray. Suddenly, the notion of the tray as a mere domestic object seemed naive. A subtle trap, or a vessel for conveying information. Perhaps the letters Mrs. Runible feared being exposed. The possibility intrigued me, but I needed confirmation. My thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Parker, who carried in his hand a small bundle of papers. "Lord Peter, we received these late last night, correspondence between Mrs. Runible and an unknown correspondent signed only as E. The letters hint at secrets too dangerous to disclose openly." I took the papers, scanning the elegant script. The content was cryptic, but hinted at blackmail, a desperate plea for silence, and an ominous warning of ruin should her enemies prevail. "E," I mused aloud, "must be our elusive Mr. Elliot, whose presence has cast a long shadow over this household." Bartholomew's face tightened. "His identity has been a matter of speculation, but no one here has seen him." "Or so we believed," I said. "Yet the footprints and the whispered voices tell another tale." Suddenly a thought struck me. "Bartholomew, you mentioned that the clocks were set differently. Could this also apply to other household devices? Perhaps the bell system?" He considered. "The servants' bells were installed several years ago, but I have not tested their accuracy recently. I requested a demonstration." The butler, somewhat reluctant, pulled the cord for the kitchen bell. A faint chime echoed from the servants' quarters, yet the delay was longer than one might expect. I noted the sluggishness. "Excellent," I said. "A delayed bell could have concealed movements, allowing a servant or an intruder to move, unseen and unheard during a crucial window." This prompted a new line of inquiry, the possibility that one of the household staff was involved in the crime, either as an accomplice or as the principal offender. I sought out the kitchen maid, a nervous young woman named Eliza, who spoke haltingly of late-night errands and odd tasks assigned by the housekeeper. Her eyes darted when I asked about the missing silver tray. "I was told to polish it on the afternoon of the day Mrs. Runible died," she said. "After that, it was taken away by Mr. Bartholomew for safekeeping." Bartholomew corrected her, gently. "I moved the tray to the library for security. Mrs. Runible was very particular about it." "So why was it missing when Inspector Parker examined the study?" I asked pointedly. "No one seems to know," said Eliza, wringing her hands. The puzzle deepened. I resolved to search the library myself. There, beneath a stack of legal documents and some old volumes on heraldry, lay the tray, unremarkable, yet it bore a faint imprint on its underside. Upon closer inspection, I discerned the faint outline of a folded letter that had once been concealed within. I carefully unfolded the letter, its script urgent and trembling. It was another plea from Mrs. Runible, this time addressed directly to Bartholomew. The content was chilling, accusations of betrayal, veiled threats, and a desperate request for silence. Bartholomew's face betrayed no emotion, yet I detected a flicker of something, perhaps guilt or a memory best left unspoken. "Lord Peter," he said quietly, "there are things in that letter which must remain confidential until you have heard all sides." "Of course," I assented, pocketing the letter. "But you must understand, Bartholomew, that trust is a rare commodity in this investigation. We are seeking the truth, whatever discomfort it may bring." I turned to Inspector Parker. "We must summon Mr. Ashcombe. His absence is no longer convenient, and he may hold the missing pieces we need." The inspector agreed, and I prepared to await the nephew's arrival. As the day wore on, I reflected on the labyrinthine nature of human relationships, the subtle betrayals that hide beneath the surface of polite society, the manipulation of time, the missing tray, the letters. Each was a cipher pointing to a deeper, darker secret. Yet the final revelation would require not just evidence, but an understanding of motive, psychology, and the fragile boundaries of trust and suspicion. In the gathering dusk, I found myself once more in the drawing room, the scene of so many whispered conversations and furtive glances. The air was thick with anticipation. When the door finally opened and Reginald Ashcombe entered, his face was a study in constrained emotion, equal parts indignation and fear. "Lord Peter Wimsey," he said curtly, "I trust this inquiry will clear my name swiftly." "Mr. Ashcombe," I replied with a slight bow, "I do hope it will. But first, we must unravel the threads that bind us all." And with that, the final act of this intricate drama was about to unfold. Lord Peter Wimsey regarded Reginald Ashcombe with a calm intensity that brooked no evasion. The young man's carefully maintained facade of arrogance and indignation began to falter beneath that steady gaze. "Mr. Ashcombe," I began, "the tangled web we weave here is not one of mere happenstance, but of deliberate design. You have asserted your innocence vehemently, yet the evidence, both physical and psychological, draws a very different picture." I motioned toward the study, the room that had borne silent witness to the fatal evening. "Consider the misaligned clock, the delayed servants' bells, the missing silver tray, small details that in isolation seem trivial but, when combined, reveal a narrative. Your arrival at the house, ostensibly from London, was recorded later than your actual presence," I continued. "The forged telegram that distracted the household was your handiwork, designed to fabricate an alibi. Yet the faint smell of cigar smoke on the torn paper, unmistakably the blend you favor, betrayed your haste." Ashcombe's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. "The crux of the matter," I said, "lies in motive. The letter, Mrs. Runible, addressed to you, threatening exposure unless certain demands were met, placed you under considerable strain. Your threat to her was not an empty boast." I paused, allowing the weight of my words to settle. "Your tampering with the clocks was a clever attempt to manipulate the timeline, creating the illusion that you were elsewhere when the deed was done. The servants' bells delayed to cover the sounds of your movements." I saw the mask crack as Ashcombe's composure dissolved. "I confess," he spat, I did what was necessary. She threatened to ruin me, and I could not allow it. But murder, I said quietly, is a poor solution to financial woes and family disgrace. Yet here we are. Inspector Parker stepped forward. "Mr. Ashcombe, you are under arrest for the murder of Mrs. Runcible." As the young man was led away, I allowed myself a small, ironic smile. The case had all the trappings of a Gothic tragedy, but at its heart was nothing more than jealousy, desperation, and human frailty, the true undercurrents beneath the polished veneer of country house life. Turning to Bartholomew, I remarked, "It seems that even the most loyal servant can harbour secrets as well, but truth as ever is a stubborn thing." Bartholomew inclined his head, the weight of the evening evident in his eyes. As I gathered my hat and gloves, preparing to leave the sombre house behind, I mused aloud. The chair was still warm, yes, but the shadows it cast are long indeed. With a final glance at Runcible House, I stepped into the fading light, leaving behind whispers, regrets, and the quiet triumph of reason over darkness.